Hello, good evening to you. If you're in Southeast Asia, um, good morning. If you're in Europe, it's 10 o'clock in London, the GMT, and 6 p.m. in Singapore, and 4:30 p.m., I believe, in Yangon, etc. Um, I am Zani. I'm hosting this Democratic Dialogue series, or more uh, dialogue series on democratic struggles across Asia, and we also cover other areas where people are struggling for their rights and freedom, as well as human rights. And today, um, my distinguished guest is Dr. James Dorsey, research fellow with the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. He's based in Singapore, and he is originally from Morocco, and he focuses on the Middle Eastern affairs, but he also has a very global perspective on geopolitics, as well as the intricacies of horse trading among different states. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Dorsey. He's also a award-winning journalist, and he writes regularly updates on various foreign policy issues concerning the Middle East. And so welcome, and thank you so much for coming to share your thoughts on US policy. Particularly the Biden administration has declared that the US is back, yeah, and democracy and opposition against authoritarianism are now part and parcel of the US foreign policy and its power projection around the world. What do you make of that rhetoric? Today is the second and last day of the Biden hosted Summit for Democracy. And so I think that it is really a timely discussion as to how credible the American support for democratization or democratic struggles and human rights around the world.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and good morning if you're like you are in Europe, and hello to everybody, irrespective of where you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think there are multiple answers and multiple facets to this. On the positive side, I think what Biden is doing is turning what is otherwise, in a sense, a naked power struggle into an issue about values. And let's keep in mind that, as a matter of principle, the values for which the United States nominally stands for, whether or not it acts on those values in its foreign policy and other policies, or with regard to its domestic problems, but the fact that it's making those values or putting them at the core of the struggle with autocracy, I think is important. I think it's also important for a reason that goes beyond whatever comparison you would want to make, for example, with the Cold War and the Soviet Union. And that is that certainly when we're dealing with the most important authoritarians or autocrats, so Xi Jinping of China, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, Narendra Modi of India, or even Viktor Orban of Hungary. We're dealing with people who fundamentally, even though they're broadly described, and this goes for Trump too, by the way, even though they are described as nationalists, they're actually civilizationalists. And they fall into two categories. One is those who adopt civilizational policies domestically. That would go for Trump. It would go for Narendra with his Islamic anti-Muslim campaign and Hindu nationalism. It would go for Viktor Orban with his, basically a Christian society. It doesn't go for Modi. Sorry, it doesn't go for Xi Jinping, or it doesn't go for Putin. They think in civilizational terms. So the borders that they recognize are not necessarily the nationally recognized borders, but they're civilizational borders. So if you look at Russia, Ukraine, what he's talking about, and he's been doing that for quite some time, is the Russian world. And the borders of the Russian world are defined either by where there are Russian speakers or by whoever happens to adhere to Russian culture. So the values battle is important. Now, on the downside, if you're sitting in a glass house, if your own home is broken, and that, in a sense, is certainly true for the United States. I mean, it's going through the same polarizing, very fundamental struggles when it comes to demography, when it comes to racism, when it comes to social economic inequality, that when it comes to how democracy is functioning and has left significant groups on the sidelines. And of course, in the way the values that you stand for are implemented in your foreign policy. And that's not a pretty picture for the United States. So I think that that in that sense, you can ask yourself whether a conference like this is the way to go. Now, the last thing, I'm giving you a long-winded answer, and I apologize for that. But the last thing that I'll say about this is, the one thing which is interesting is autocracies, authoritarian or not, the non-democrats and the illiberal Democrats need, democracy is such a term that they need to identify with it. So North Korea is the Democratic Republic of North Korea. China just defined itself as a democracy. There is nothing democratic in China's bone under Xi Jinping. But nonetheless, what that values game has done is that has become the name of the game. And that's, in a sense, if you wish, a victory in the first round. It's not a victory, but if you're going through a number of rounds, it's a first round victory.
Right. You mentioned the United States as a broken house or glass. While the new American administration by Joe Biden, is attempting to reclaim the American position on democratization, and of course, at the ideological level, the way you put it is the value level. Of course, it's very important. Yeah, you state that the representative form of government is part of your value system. It is definitely categorically, desirable, more desirable than any other the political rhetoric coming from the communist China nominally, or the Putin's Tsarist Russia. Putin, as you know, has taken Russia, or quote unquote, the Russian mind back to the Tsarist era, right? And the Putin's trying to shut down any type of research into Stalinist crimes. We know what happened in the after Stalin took over, with the gulags and millions who perished in these the death camps in Siberia. But at the same time, I wonder the U.S. Conduct abroad, right? Of course, as a Democrat, a dissident, and an activist myself, I would rather see the United States succeed in offering support for the people who struggle, against totalitarian or various types of neo-totalitarian regimes in Middle East, in Southeast Asia, for instance, where you are based. We are a sea of autocracy, with a sprinkle of quasi or semi-enlightened regimes, and in places like Indonesia or Malaysia. The rest of Southeast Asia is pretty much a dim political space for people who have to live there. That's like 500 million. It's a massive number of people who have been controlled by a handful of rather murderous regimes across the world, and definitely in Southeast Asia. But what do you make of a long series of United States military adventurism, all the debacles, going all the way back to Korea, Vietnam, a lot of Middle Eastern countries have been destabilized by the U.S. foreign policy. So on one hand, we've got the U.S. House broken because that they've got white nationalists and Christian fundamentalists pushing back what they considered a more inclusive, multiculturalist, more egalitarian social movement, right? And then you've got the U.S. foreign policy that has left carnage and destruction around the world, including the Middle East and places in Africa.
Well, I think several things. First of all, just as a matter of principle, in terms of your analysis of Southeast Asia, I think I would put Singapore somewhere in the middle. It's not a black hole. In fact, it may be authoritarian, but it has a lot of checks and balances. And I know that firsthand, because you only meet the authoritarian state in Singapore when you meet it. You realize how sophisticated it is. But I changed Singapore law in a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the process, I changed procedure because I didn't have a right to do that. So just as an aside and for the record, which doesn't mean that Singapore is a liberal democracy. It is not. Now, on the broader issue, I think you've got two things. On the domestic American side, you have the two groups that you mentioned. But they're very different groups. The white nationalists are driven by fear. The demography of the United States has changed. And let's face it, the immigration policy and so on, by definition, it was going to change. And the people who are afraid of that change are also people who benefit at least from the system. So I think with regard to them, irrespective of whether one agrees with their views and how they are expressed, those are real issues that need to be addressed. I think the second issue that you have is, of course, the racism and the structural racism in the United States. In the case of the evangelicals, you're talking about people with a deep-seated belief that are, as far as I'm concerned, fundamentalist as very fundamentalist parts of the Jewish community or the Muslim community. So we're talking about very different animals. Now, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, if you really draw a lesson from it, there are two lessons. Military intervention works only if you stay the course and build a state. You cannot go in, change the regime, walk out, and think that it's all going to work out. Or stay long, but not build a state properly, allow for corruption, and then it blows up in your face.
Give us some examples of where the United States just went in quickly, sort of like a hit and run, and then leave hoping that normalcy will be restored in the process, or like where they went in, attempted to build a state and fail categorically? I mean, what other cases do you have in mind?
1958 in Lebanon.
What happened then?
Well, there the Americans went in basically to stabilize. It was a quick in and out. Nothing was resolved in Lebanon. Look at the multinational force, which included the Americans, the French, and the Italians in 1980-81, where you had the major attacks on the US and French barracks and the attacks on the US embassy in Beirut. Nothing was resolved. And look at Afghanistan, 20 years of war.
And,
now,
and the billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground, right?
Absolutely. Now, so that's one lesson. The second lesson is that you can't just simply externally introduce democracy. If you look, I wrote a book in several years ago, together with my wife, who's a Filipina academic and activist, and was part of the overthrow of Marcos and part of the first government of Corina Aquino. And so what we did is we compared political transition in the Middle East and in South Asia. So specifically the 2011 cases in the Middle East, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen.
And you're talking about the Arab Spring,
yeah,
so-called.
Well, yeah, the first wave of popular Arab revolts, right. And obviously we compared it with Indonesia, with the Philippines, to a degree with Myanmar, and so what you see, and it's a very problematic issue. There was one major difference, for example, in U.S. policy between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. In Southeast Asia, the US military put a lot of money and effort into the training of armed forces. And that training included sensitizing the armed forces to human rights issues, for example. In the Middle East, the United States assumed the position that it was hopeless. No point in doing it. One of the reasons why, leaving Duterte aside now for a minute, or obviously what's happening in Myanmar, but as a matter of principle, one of the reasons why those political transitions were relatively successful, at least for a significant period of time, was that there was an interdependency, which the United States encouraged in various of its policies, military assistance, development aid, and so on. There was an interdependency between the military and civil society, and there was a strong civil society. The military could not achieve whatever goals it wanted on its own. It needed civil society. And by the same token, civil society needed the military. And so that's some of the reasons why it succeeded. And those balances were not there in the Middle East, and the United States had not helped create those balances. I think that, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, if you look at US policy towards the Middle East, the first decade of the of this century was actually a very interesting decade. US policy in the Middle East prior to that decade and after that decade, so with other words, today, was stability stability rather than political change. Political change was too risky. So you supported the autocracies. 9/11 happened, and you think back of 9/11 of 2001, 2000, whatever those years. I mean, George Bush was horrible. Today he looks good. One of the few things that few people realized was that Bush and Condoleezza Rice actually recognized and said that the United States had a responsibility, not a main responsibility, but had a responsibility for the 9/11 attacks, because these autocracies, that's what they produced ultimately. And the conclusion was, we need a push for democracy. And, there were initiatives, I think it was a freedom initiative, or whatever Bush called it, and they failed, poor implementation, and so on and so forth. But that notion had changed, and we're now back to that notion. And that's problematic today, in my mind, much more problematic than it was before, because we live in an era of defiance and dissent. So starting with, if you look at the last decade, it was bookended by Arab revolts at both ends of it. So the 2011 protests, 2019, 2020, you had Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, all of them toppled Arab leaders. Not all of them achieved what they wanted to achieve, but they toppled Arab leaders. And in both cases, the Arab protests were maybe the most dramatic of what was a global development, with global protest. And I think that that's what we're going to have going forward, which makes the US policy of stability rather than change even more risky.
I do have one issue with the the U.S. democracy promotion discourse, in light of its long decades of essentially, privileging U.S. interests, commercial, strategic, primarily, but over the locally developed, if you will, homegrown, democratic efforts or democratic regimes. Like two examples, come to mind, and the one is Chile. The other people call it 9/11. The Allende government was socialistic. In those days, that the word socialism was not a dirty, unpopular word, not yet, discredited the way it had been. And the other one, of course, is the Iran in the 1950s. Right, it set off, a chain of events in Iran, and we ended up with a theocratic Khomeini regime in the late 70s, after the Iranian public decided that the Shah, the American puppet, was too much and no good for the public, right? And so, I mean, like at one point, I found myself in a room with some of the U.S. foreign policy players at Brookings Institution, and the one marched in and said, well, the American foreign policy is about values, and the democracy has been claimed, quote unquote, American values, and say we have to balance values and interest. Of course, both of us would agree that any national government would do that, who claim to have a humanistic values as part of their policy pillars. But I think, having seen the United States, almost universally anywhere in the world, the privileging or putting its material interest above the values or the interest of the local communities in different parts of the world, where they try to reclaim the ownership of say natural resources or extractive industry, oil, gas, and the other minerals, right? Well, what do you say to your people who would say that the American value pronouncements cannot be taken at face value?
Look, I think there's several things here, and I'm very familiar and was very close to what happened in Chile in 73 and lived in Iran in 79, 80 when the revolution took place. So I'm very familiar with both. I think there's several things here. One, regime change as a policy. And let's see if we can take Biden by his word. But if you look at what Brett McGurk said after the Manama Dialogue in October, November in Bahrain, he very clearly said, we're out of the regime change business. Now, that's in a sense a problematic statement, if you wish. So you don't want the United States going around trying to overthrow governments it happens not to like. But you do want the support for civil society and all kinds of other policies. So I think we need to see what is meant with this statement. That's one. Two, by definition, so take development aid. By definition, if I'm ensuring that one of the major beneficiaries, if not the major beneficiary of that aid, is going to be my own companies versus companies in whatever country I'm trying to help, then what's the definition of development aid here?
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, the same is true for the Europeans. The same is true for the Russians. The same is true for the Chinese. And if the Iranians play a role in reconstruction in Syria, the same will be true for the Iranians. So this is not a uniquely American problem. It's a global problem. It is a problem where the United States should be the one that takes the lead and sets an example, and it hasn't done that. Or it's set an example for everybody else to do exactly what it does right now. So, I think it's a bit unfair towards the Americans to simply say you're favoring your own companies when that is what everybody does, and what the United States on the one hand. So but at the same time, should they be held to a higher standard because they set higher standards for themselves?
Or do they? Let me play devil's advocate here. Do they play, or do they set higher standard for themselves, or do they construct themselves as this, a cut above the entire class of nation states, and say we are city upon the hill, we are, this American exceptionalism, right? And that seems to be extremely problematic, both at home in the United States and around the world, when the ideological or value statements become so irreconcilably contradictory, in terms of the deeds and the behavior and the policies on the ground. Then you've got a serious problem. Why should the world treat the United States as an exceptionally unique power? Exceptional in the sense that the United States has close to 1,000 military bases around the world. What are they defending?
Well, first of all, I think that there was a mission there for certainly post World War II, for a significant period of time. there was almost a missionary aspect to the United States. And Americans really just believed that everybody wanted to have that American way of life. And to be fair, there was good reason to believe that. The popularity of American culture, whether it was jazz and music, literature, Hollywood, I mean, those were truly cultural goods that had been more or less globally embraced. The power of English as a language, and sure, there's the Brits and the British Empire and all of that, but still, in many ways, the fact that British is still such a strong, English is still such the major language today is because of what the United States was. I think that's one. Two, the United States, I mean, the glass is half full or half empty. So you can go around and say, and look at all these places where the United States has wreaked havoc. But it's also been a real stabilizer. Being a real stabilizer doesn't necessarily mean that all of its policies were even-handed. Look at what's happening in the Middle East now. Because of uncertainty of the continued commitment of the United States to the region. And you can question policies towards Iran, this, that, the other. But fact of the matter is that to some degree, the Middle East would be a greater mess had the United States not been there.
But
hold on.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, let me just conclude. Now, having said all of that, I think the perception of the United States of itself, or of many in the United States, of the United States and themselves, has significantly changed with the experience of the Trump administration and the polarization, what happened on the 6th of January this year at the US Capitol. So you have two groups. One group basically really doesn't necessarily want to deal with the world anymore. And the other group really suddenly realizes that, what they have on display is not something people want to emulate. So I think that missionary zeal has gotten a real hit. And that may be healthy. And it levels the playing field in some ways. So I think in some ways you've got to look at this in evolutionary terms, if you wish.
But can you not say, on the other hand, because we are interpreting the events and the behavior of one of the greatest powers that history has ever known, the United States, vis-a-vis the rest of others. So take, for instance, like the Middle East, which is, one of your major civilizational areas. Some would argue that it isn't simply the uncertainty of the U.S. commitment to stay, since in 2008 Obama made this Asian pivot, or later renamed rebalancing, right? Reduction of troops and American commitment in the Middle East to begin to meet the challenge as Washington sees it coming from Beijing and China, right? So you've got several major Middle Eastern countries where the U.S. involvement has left these building blocks of the interstate system completely destabilized. Say, for instance, Iraq, and then you've got Libya and Gaddafi, right? And I'm not saying like these countries were run by angelic, democratic leaders. They're far from it. They were monsters in their own right over there. But the United States involvement has produced a long chain of reactions. The ISIS, for instance, that they came out of the Baath Party, disintegrating. And then, like, this perennial, nearly, the 80 years issue of the displacement of Palestinians, right? And that the United States serving not as an honest equalizer, broker, leveling the playing field between the victims and the oppressor, if you want to use that term, which I will. The U.S. is seen as an extremely uneven-handed, external power that has historically been taking the side of the oppressor of the Palestinian people, namely Israel. So if you look at it from let's just say, if you put it, glass is half full or half empty the perspective, how would you counter that argument that U.S. has destabilized the Middle East and now U.S. is raising the temperature in Asia, vis-a-vis China? I mean, and I'm from Burma. I'm an Asian. I do not welcome either the United States or China if they pursue their own, imperial projects in our backyard.
I think you can only make that premise if you sweep everything into one big basket and say they're all equal. They're not. So let's break down the constituent elements here. The fundamental mistake that the United States made in some ways was not the invasion in Iraq itself. So not, that was a mistake, but it was not a mistake because you cannot do military intervention, whatever. It changed the political landscape by bringing, at the end of the day, Iraq is a Shia majority country. That doesn't make it in any way subservient, whatever, the Shia community to the Iranians, but there is there's an affinity, there's a natural relationship with very deep-seated differences, but nonetheless. So the moment you started to create that, change the balance, remove a Sunni minority dictatorship, Ba'ath or not, that's where, to me, the fundamental mistake was. Not that it was wrong to have an open society in which the majority is the majority and the minority rights are theoretically protected, but the United States had not prepared for that. And therefore, it offered all kinds of groups opportunities to exploit that may not have been there with a military intervention, in which, don't forget, Bramer's basically a dismissal of all Baathists from the Iraqi military. So I think that's one case. Take Libya, take Syria. Let me just make one remark. I would not phrase ISIS having come out of the Ba'ath Party. At the end of the day, ISIS was a fracturing within the jihadist movement. Assad may have encouraged that with the release of prisoners early on in the revolt in Syria, but it's not so that ISIS came out of the. What it did do is, of course, that some of Saddam Hussein's supporters and senior officials, in a sense, saw radical Islam as their opportunity and exploited that. So that's one. But if you look at Syria as such, you look at Yemen and you look at Libya and you look at Egypt, by the way. Political transition is chaotic. It takes time to balance out. In all of those four cases, it was not the United States that destabilized. It was the Gulf states. It was Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In Libya, it got more complicated, obviously, because everybody and his mother moved in. But ultimately, that's what it was. Same, so, and why were they doing that? They were doing it, first of all, because for a number of reasons. Obviously, popular sovereignty is not what absolute monarchs want to see. They don't want to see successful regime change. And they don't want to see alternative forms of Islamic governance. So these revolts were and remain in their minds an existential threat. Now you can step in and say the United States didn't do enough to stabilize these transitions, this, that, the other, but I think it's wrong to say the United States was the destabilizer there.
But the
finally on the Israeli-Arab conflict, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Sure, the Israelis are the occupier, the Palestinians are the occupied, and the Americans have always been pro-Israeli on this. But first of all, if you take foreign policy as an expression of domestic policy, the evangelical community in the United States, in a country of 300 million people, is 100 million people.
Did you say Christian evangelicals?
Yeah, I said the evangelicals,
Right.
Christian Zionists, all of these
Right.
groups. That's a third of the population. That's no government can not take that into account. Now, the fact of the matter is, you said 80 years conflict, 70 years conflict, whatever it may be. For the vast period of that time, there were only two Arab leaders who had any sense of how the United States worked. And it was King Hussein of Jordan. Sorry, three. King Hussein of Jordan, King Hassan of Morocco, and Anwar Sadat. The rest had no idea. And so the playing field was left open to Israel. There was no pushback. So, Arab leaders have a part of the blame here.
Yeah, sorry to interject, because I think your previous analysis on the U.S. administration's declaration of support for opposition movement against autocracies, authoritarian regimes, as well as the support for democratic movements, right? And you said the autocrats in the Gulf states, that you mentioned two already, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have nothing to worry about, because if we take the argument, one step further, the argument that it wasn't the United States that was or that had been as destabilizer, but the two Gulf states, involved in Yemen and other places, and U.S. is basically supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia. I mean, to the tunes of like billions. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Obama or Biden. Yeah, and the Saudi has been a major weapons customer for the U.S. arms industry. So how does this square? I mean, you've got two major Gulf states acting as essentially like destabilizers, ideologically, as well as in terms of its warmongering. The MBS just went to Qatar, and for the first time since the Saudis blockaded the Qatar. So how can we understand the U.S. role in supporting democracy in the Middle East when it is closely allied with Saudis and UAE the two destabilizers?
First of all, one of the things that I've always thought about the United States is you have these principles, you have these standards. And to be fair, it's impossible to just simply implement them universally. But the United States has never, whatever administration we talk about, has never articulated a policy on when you implement these or stand for these values and when you don't and why you don't in those circumstances. So as a result, we don't know what the policy is, and it all looks hypocritical. So I think that's one US problem that the US has never addressed. I think they're also torn. So they obviously favored the revolts. I mean, going back to what I said about President Bush, if you go back and think back 20 years, what the mood was in Washington and Western capitals in 2000, post 9/11, 2002, 2003, everybody was waiting for the Arab Street to act. And the Arab Street didn't act on their timeline. And so anybody who then after that was saying, well, the Arab Street's important, was laughed out the door because the Arab Street waited a decade before they did something. So there's a very torn policy here. So I think that the United States was happy to see some of these regimes gone. I mean, Gaddafi was not a particular favorite in the West, for example. And Ali Abdullah Saleh was problematic. So it's very contradictory, and the Americans have never tried to explain and balance it and manage those contradictions. But I think the other part of this is that, sure, you've had Obama and even before that, but the overthrow, particularly of Mubarak in Egypt, where the United States was not going to give Mubarak a helping hand. They were going to let things happen as they were. And they were not in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood emerging as a major political force that would form a first democratically elected government. But they were on the principle of on democratic principles willing to allow it to happen. And they also went to great lengths to the degree that they could to try and prevent the military coup. That for the Gulf states, particularly for the Emiratis and for the Saudis, was a wake-up call. So that's where uncertainty about what US commitment meant in the Gulf began. And again, part of it lies, there's a failure here on both sides of the divide. So the last time we've had a real military and political doctrine, US political and military doctrine for the Middle East was the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine was specifically geared towards any external threat to the Gulf security. At that time, the Soviet Union. It never was defined by the United States as the protection of the regimes in the region against an internal domestic or regional threat. But that's how it came to be interpreted by the Gulf states. And the Americans never really went out of their way to correct that misinterpretation. So the overthrow of Mubarak or the attack on the oil fields in 2019 by Iran, in the perception of Gulf states, particularly against the Saudis and the Emiratis, was the Americans no longer committed to what they had committed to. Whereas the United States would tell you, well, we never committed to that. They will also tell you we did respond to the oil field attacks and the attacks on the shipping. We hit and killed the Al-Quds commander, Qasem Soleimani, 3 months later. And that was our response. So I think it's a much more complex thing that we're looking at here, in which there's policy failures, policy shortages, miscommunications, misunderstandings, failures to correct those misunderstandings, and you get a mess at the result at the end.
Of course, yeah. Can I invite you to comment on the U.S. policy, and obviously, democracy promotion, civil society support, with respect to Asia, right? Particularly the view that is emerging now with respect to the U.S. The policy, foreign policy lens. Everything is seen through the lens, essentially, I wouldn't say anti-China, but more like meeting the challenge that China is posing increasingly over Taiwan Strait, the economic espionage. This morning I woke up to the news that maybe the Chinese state is behind the hackings of Southeast Asian organizations and the states and whatnot. And we have in Burma today 10 months old, essentially a revolution, both violent and non-violent. That's going on, and it's not going to go away. And the movement on the ground in Burma across the country has taken any analyst by surprise, because the military has always been able to put down any rebellion, and obviously now the Burmese military has shifted its paradigm from putting it down to keeping itself alive, right? Because the people are openly calling for the heads of anyone that is associated with the military. And also we've got the genocide against a Muslim, the Rohingyas, right? That has been widely recognized as such. The United States authorized, the State Department particularly, authorized or commissioned the 3 months long forensic study of what transpired, around the allegations of the genocide, and using, I think, like $1.5 million. And the law firm that conducted these, the forensic the investigations, finally came out and said, we found evidence of genocide, very clear. And the Americans, both the Trump administration and Biden administration, refused to call a spade a spade. And then, the Uyghur scenario arises, and the American high officials, like foreign secretaries and whatnot, they're tweeting like mad that this is genocide. And now, the Americans and the British and Australians are boycotting the China's Winter Olympic next year, right? So these developments. So on the one hand, we look to the United States, despite the contradictions, despite the shortcomings, and despite the track record, the appeal of the United States as an ally in a struggle against any type of authoritarian regime remains strong. Yeah, and but at the same time, U.S. is distilling everything into its the lens against the rise of imperialist China. How do you see this playing out on the ground in Southeast Asia? I mean, Singapore is there, quite a significant player in this so-called great power struggle. So can I invite you to comment on on this issue. I mean, this is emerging, and that it just imposed arms embargo against Cambodia a few days ago, vis-a-vis the Cambodia's very, very close strategic ties with Beijing.
Look, let me say a few things. First of all, on the broader issue, I have no. I mean, I'm not aware of the lawyer's investigation into the Rohingya question, but I have no doubt that it's accurate. I think, in terms of the reliability of the United States, I think there's some realities one simply has to take into account. That is that the Americans do themselves damage, not only by not articulating a clear implementation of policy, rather than a bunch of principles, so that one understands what yes, what no, but also by demonizing the opponent. And it becomes a sense of tunnel vision, whether that's the view of the Vietnamese in the 60s, the view of the Soviet Union, the view of Iran, and now the view of China. So, if you're going to demonize in that form, you don't see the multidimensionality of it. And I think that's a problem for the Americans. I think it's a problem for for its allies.
So you're saying that Americans are colorblind? They can only see things in black and white, like good versus evil, and they always see themselves as good.
In a sense. But having said that, so there's nobody, okay, except for the Europeans, there is nobody out there but the Americans and the Europeans who, if you're an activist or a proponent of human rights, can turn to. And it may not be the fully open door and whatever it is, but there's no other address. So you have to deal with what you have to deal. I think that's one. Two, in the case of Myanmar, and you know that better than certainly I do, and better than many, that Myanmar, with US help, had a very strong underground civil society over the decades, very resilient. And which is probably one reason why you're seeing the revolution that you're talking about now, and the ability for that. I think more to your specific question, ASEAN split when it comes at the end of the day to China and the United States. And you mentioned Singapore. Singapore's in a difficult position, also because of demographics. But has played its cards probably better than others in this. I think the issue going forward is China is what China is. It has enormous economic clout. I don't think anybody wants to be reduced to stooges, to being told how to march and what you can say and what you cannot say, which is basically what Chinese policy is, very coercive. And I think that will backfire. Whether the United States can take advantage of it is really going to depend on how the United States positions itself and how it stabilizes, how it stabilizes its own, puts its own house back in order at home, but also how it stabilizes and demonstrates that it is reliable. And when it comes to the issues of human rights, democracy, what have you, part of that is going to be a clearly articulated understanding of where it will act and where it will not act and why it makes those choices.
what does the next 5 to 10 years look like for you? That being like in the middle of Southeast Asia, the U.S.-China rivalry is intensifying, and the Chinese are not lying down and taking the U.S. push for stronger anti-China forces. That is democratic struggles across Southeast Asia. I mean, a governmental boycott of Winter Olympic by Anglophone countries, Australia, Britain, and the United States said, the Chinese are threatening back, and we are going to punish you, kind of thing. You know what I mean? You mentioned like Chinese foreign policy as being coercive, and I'm sure you remember like this ASEAN-China summit in Vietnam, I believe Hanoi. The Chinese foreign minister was essentially targeting to bully George Yeo, at the time foreign minister, because the Singapore was seen as siding with the United States essentially on South China Sea and whatnot. So what does the next 5 year look like?
Well, look, I think that too many. I'm not going to go out and look. First of all, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did, and if I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be sitting here. That's one. Two, there are too many variables. So variable number one, what China are we going to be dealing with over 5 or 10 years? China without Xi may be a very different China to deal with. What America are we going to be dealing with? Are we going to have Trump in 2024? And we're back to square one? And again, I attribute greater importance to that, and you probably may empathize with that. I think we're going to see a decade of popular agitation. I sort of called the first decade, as it was evolving, a decade of defiance and dissent. I think we're dealing with an era of defiance and dissent. We're now in the second decade. And those cycles are usually 25 to 50 years. So I think that, popular sentiment or popular discontent, whatever, is going to be an important factor in the next 5 to 10 years. So what you're really talking about here is you're talking about a lot of black swans. And so the best you can do is try and understand what those black swans potentially could be and what the consequences of that, and so it doesn't hit you unprepared. So that's that. I mean, I think about as far as I would want to go in fortune telling.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, you've got empirical evidence on the ground, like what is going on in Thailand, the last 2 years with the democratization effort, and in my own country, the armed and violent revolution, the Malaysia, then like young Singaporeans they're very discontented. They want more than apartment.
Yeah, except look, I think, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, also another thing is what happens in the elections in the Philippines.
That's right.
I think that I've been now in Singapore for 11 years. There's always been grumbling. But fact of the matter is, I think there are several things which Singapore stands out in. It's a government that's delivered. And it's a government that's delivered. It's a government that's ensured that everybody has a stake in society. So it's just, its response to the Muslim community with 9/11 was inclusive, not putting them on the defensive. So yes, there's grumbling. And yes, there's a new generation. And it's a generation that takes a lot of things for granted. and there's a generational change in leadership, in political leadership of the country. That's all true, but I think that people grumbling and people want to put at risk what they have are two different things. So I think one's got to be careful with how one judges that grumbling in Singapore.
Well, you've got very sophisticated leadership there that
Absolutely
delivers, as you said, and so that essentially preempt any prospect for a radical movement emerging, unlike Burma or Thailand.
That would be true across the Middle East and elsewhere. If you had the same sort of enlightened leadership, whether or not it's fully democratic or not. Let me just on the geopolitical side add one more thing in Southeast Asia. What we have not talked about is the elephant in the room,
which is
that's Indonesia.
Right.
I mean, Indonesia is by far the largest, and maybe in some ways most powerful country in the region. And it has not really projected that power.
Well, it is starting to. I think it starts to see themselves as a, part of G22 or just something. Yeah. Well, it starts to see that it has to punch its weight, and ASEAN is holding it back.
Well, I'm not sure that ASEAN. First of all, yes, G20. It chairs the G20 for the next year. That's one. Two, interestingly enough, and I mean, and this is again a mixed picture. So there's lots of question marks you can raise. In fact, about the democratic record, human rights record, this, what, the other, about the Jokowi government versus and so the same sort of issues on a smaller scale that we're talking about with the United States. There's one thing that Indonesia has that most of the other Southeast Asian states don't have, and for that matter, what many other states do not have, and that it has a and again, it needs in some ways it needs to be put to the test, but it has a very powerful religious political movement that sets values in much the same way that the United States does that. And that has we'll see what happens within the next 2 weeks when they have their 5-year annual, five-year Congress and vote new leadership. But so in that sense, Indonesia is the elephant in the room. And we'll see, for example, how those values are projected in the G20.
Well, then, if that's the case, that Southeast Asia will have to, I suppose, look to Indonesia to start playing, a more democratic foreign policy games, rather than, because the region has been let down by so many external powers.
Sure, but look around the region.
Right.
You've got Laos, Cambodia, frankly, who cares?
Right. Or Brunei.
Or Brunei. Well, at least Brunei has some oil. But basically, you have Vietnam, which is an economic powerhouse, and naturally less inclined towards the Chinese. You have the Philippines, which is a mess at the moment. You have Singapore, which has been, I would almost use the word brilliant at punching above its weight, being a very quiet international player, understanding what relevance means, and ensuring that it remains relevant. And then you have Indonesia. Naturally, Indonesia should be what the United States is in the West. given its resources, given its size of population, its geography, the whole 9 yards. It hasn't played.
What do you think is holding back Indonesia in terms of its potential to play basically the lead dog in the region? Like a 300 million population with.
Well, I think part of it is, it takes a while to settle into, once you've done the political transition. I think corruption is something that is holding back Indonesia significantly. I think also that vision. I'm not, the vision has not been in government. The vision has been in civil society. You can agree with the vision, disagree with the vision, but vision's been in civil society, and part of that civil society also has a leg in the government. But the degree to which it's been able to make that the vision of the country or the government as such has in a sense been limited. Again, the G20 is going to be an interesting exercise also in that regard.
Well, Dr. James Dorsey, it's really been enlightening and a real pleasure to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much for taking over an hour to explain such vital issues as the American influence, good and bad, around the world as well as in our region. And thanks again, sir.
No, it's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, you have a good rest of the evening. Okay.
And all the best to you.
Thank you. Thank you.